Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Morris with AFS 630, and we really appreciate you logging in this morning to check out our ACS webinar. We really hope to make this a productive hour for you and try to explain some things about how the ACS works and why we have the ACS and all that good stuff. I've already introduced myself again, Chris Morris. I work with the FAA in the Airman testing branch, AFS 630. We're the branch that takes care of the knowledge test and things like the ACS, the PTS, and several publications like the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, those sorts of things. We do have a couple other folks on the call today. I have Trey McClure, he's with AFS 800, and I have Margaret Morrison with AFS 630. And again, they're monitoring those questions that you submit, both for technical issues and also if there's a real short little question and they feel like they can answer it, they might answer to you right then. But again, generally speaking, don't expect an answer to your ACS question until maybe midweek or so. We'll send that out by email. This course is designed to supplement the course that we have produced and have at FAAsafety.gov. I hope that some of you have had a chance to see that course. I have the course number there on screen, ALC449, and it's a nice little overview and it gives you some more background about the ACS and kind of where it came from. By the way, you don't have to write all these numbers down, any kind of web links I give you or email addresses, because I'm going to also provide this presentation to you. I'm going to email it at the same time I email the questions. So you'll have this entire PowerPoint file, and you can look at it whenever you wish. You'll have all the information in the file. So we hope that that makes it helpful. And I've already mentioned this bit to you. We will be answering all of your questions. You can expect them a written response, usually by midweek or so. So let's talk about what we're actually going to address today. We're going to talk a bit about why we're changing, why we're going to the ACS. We're also going to talk about who developed the ACS, and the most interesting bit, I think, is how does it work. This is sort of the technical discussion of how would the ACS be used to a plan of action, which is used during a practical test. We'll wrap up with some other things that are having to change because of the ACS. We'll talk about when's it going into effect and for what certifications. And then we'll wrap up a couple things, maybe suggestions, what should you do, and then where do I get help? We'll have that there for you. So we're going to start off with why did we have to change? Why did we feel that the PTS was no longer sufficient and we needed the ACS? Well, if you're like me, when you first start hearing about the Airman certification standards, you make the assumption, well, this must be about the practical test. They must be wanting to improve or somehow change the practical test, because that seems only natural, why they would change the PTS to the ACS. In reality, and this might surprise you, it really starts with the knowledge test. It honestly had very little to do with the practical test. And this change has been driven by several factors related to our knowledge test questions. I'm going to give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain as to how knowledge questions have historically been developed within the agency. Normally what happens, and this is over the years, right? AFS 630, the branch where I work, has a handful of aviation safety inspectors and other what we call subject matter experts. And those folks essentially are assigned particular banks of questions. Like you might have one inspector that is assigned private pilot questions. And that person's job, amongst other jobs, is to update and maintain the questions used in the private knowledge test. So you have one person, let me rephrase that. You had one person who their job was to write knowledge questions And of course, all of our knowledge questions were based on an FAA reference. So what would happen is you would have this person sitting in a queue, and they would open up a knowledge reference, like let's say the Airman, how about the PHAC, Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. They would open the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, and they would flip to a particular topic. Maybe it's airspace, maybe it's weather, flight planning, whatever. And they would basically just pull out a question. They would find some content that they thought was interesting. They would develop a question. That question might then be reviewed by one or maybe two other safety inspectors, and then the question would go live. It would go to actual tests being administered to people taking the knowledge test. Well, this process has, over the years, led to some rather strange sorts of questions. And maybe some of you are shaking your heads going, yes, I've seen some really strange questions. Questions, for example, the height of blowing dust, you know, just really, maybe some really strange, detailed questions that at the end of the day you say, well, really, what does that have to do with me being a better pilot? And the agency recognized that our questions were not tied to any kind of a standard. It was basically just whatever the ASI decided to write the question about. If it was in a reference, it was fair game. So the agency recognized that just like the practical test had a reference, which is the PTS, the knowledge test also needed a reference. It needed some sort of a baseline document that would say, these are our appropriate subject materials to have in a knowledge test. And we just didn't have that. Back in 2011, the FAA created the Airman Testing Standards and Training ARC. There's not going to be a test question on that. You don't have to worry about memorizing it, okay? But basically what it means is back in 2011, the agency put together a group, and that group's assignment was figure out how to fix the knowledge test. Look at the problem and suggest some solutions. In 2012, that group came back and said, we think you need to develop an ACS. Of course, they spent the year coming up with the concept of an ACS, what might it look like, and that sort of thing. And they convinced the agency that this was the right idea, this was the way to go. So the ACS is actually not only a standards document for the practical test, but it also is a standards document for the knowledge test. And that's kind of a big job, and that explains a lot of why the document grew. Those of you that have compared the practical test to the ACS, you sort of recognize that there's a lot more content in the ACS. So there's kind of an important thing I want to share with you, and that's who actually developed the ACS. Historically, these sorts of documents have been developed internally by the agency. Well, in this case, the groups that developed the ACS is actually a combination of industry leaders and the FAA. This has been a group effort by industry and the Federal Aviation Administration. And this is a change in the right direction, because industry is who has to be able to use this document. And we recognize that only having the FAA provide input into its design is really ignoring half the discussion. So we recognize that industry must play a role if we're going to develop a better follow-up to the practical test standards. I want to show you a slide now that shows you who is involved in the development of the ACS. This isn't even necessarily a complete list, but it gives you a pretty good idea of all the folks involved. And there's probably a few new names that we need to add to the list. I'm not going to read through this list, but if you take a moment and just kind of cruise through there, you'll see that there's some really big hitters from industry involved in this process. And I also want to say that by involved, I don't mean that they're making the occasional suggestion that sort of thing. I mean, these folks were actually writing the ACS. They were divided into teams, essentially, and these folks were given an assignment: start with the private PTS, move into this framework of the ACS, and over the years, they did that for us. I have underlined the FAA side of it, different branches that have been involved. So this has been a real collaborative effort, and that's a nice change. I think that's a step in the right direction, because it has to serve everybody. It has to serve not only the FAA, but it has to serve all of you in industry. So I've kind of laid the groundwork for you. I told you why we had to have it, and I wanted to explain to you who was involved. But now we're going to get to kind of the meat and potatoes of it. It's probably what most of you are interested in hearing about, which is how does it work? How is the ACS used to develop a plan of action? And a plan of action, by the way, is what the designee uses to administer a Checkride, a practical test. Designees are required to prepare ahead of time a written plan of action that is essentially the Checkride. It's like a script. You can think of it that way. So that's what we're going to get into, is how does the ACS work. The first bit here is some usage tips. I would encourage you, after you get off the webinar here, or when you have a chance the next week or 2 weeks, download the ACS from our website. I'll give you the link in a moment, and spend some time getting used to the document. That starts with reading the introduction. The introduction is different from the PTS. The PTS introduction was, I think, about 10 pages. The ACS introduction is around 2 or so. So it's much shorter. It's been rephrased. A lot of content that was in the PTS introduction has been moved to the appendices in the ACS. But you need to spend some time going through there, and then I would skip the body of the ACS and go straight to the appendices. And we're going to real briefly talk about what's in the appendices, and then we'll talk about the body. So appendices number 1 is knowledge test, eligibility, prereqs, and testing centers. Remember that this document is not only a document for the practical test, like the PTS was, but it's now a document for the knowledge test as well. So it's going to contain information for both knowledge test and practical test. There's nothing in appendices 1 that's going to really give you any heartburn, but you want to kind of peruse that one. Appendices 2 is knowledge test procedures and tips. Some interesting information in there, especially if you'll be taking a knowledge test soon, or recommending an applicant to go take the knowledge test. So that's a good one to take a look at. Appendices 3 is about the knowledge test report. Things such as how do you replace a lost copy and that sort of thing. Again, you don't have to read every word, but you might want to kind of peruse that appendices. Appendices 4 is the practical test eligibility and prerequisites. And this is essentially going to point you back to the regulation, the applicable section of Part 61, and just outlines when someone is eligible to take a particular Checkride. Appendices 5 is where you want to slow down, where you want to start reading a bit more carefully. Practical test roles, responsibilities, and outcomes. This is the same section that used to be in the introduction, which explained what is satisfactory performance. What type of action would make a Checkride be unsatisfactory? And this is where it's explained. What type of things would constitute satisfactory or unsatisfactory? Also talks about the other outcomes of a practical test, the letter of discontinuance, notice of disapproval, or what we all hope for, the temporary certificate being issued. The information here hasn't changed in concept from the PTS, but it's been rephrased. So certainly spend some time there and make sure you don't have any questions about Appendix 5. The next one is 6, safety of flight. This has a lot of good information in it, such as safety recommendations. For example, how low should you be to perform an engine out maneuver in a multi-engine check ride. That sort of information is there, so you want to make sure you hit that one. 7 is aircraft equipment requirements. Again, this is from the PTS. You shouldn't find anything new here that's going to get you worked up, but it's pretty straightforward. 8 is use of FTDs, and then 9 and 10 are references, abbreviations, and acronyms. So I don't think you'll have any issue with any of those in there. So that kind of gives you an outline of what's going to be in the appendices. So moving on now, we're going to talk about the body of the ACS. So we're going to get a little bit more detail here, but I think it's important so that all of you have enough information so that you understand how the ACS is used during the check ride. So let's start with the organization. Well, the good news is it's organized the same as the PTS. You have areas of operations, tasks, and then you have elements. So that hasn't changed any. And we'll look at an example. I'm showing you an image of the pre-flight preparation area of operation from the private pilot ACS. So I'll point there, the pre-flight preparation represents the area of operation. Cross-country flight planning would be your task. And then all those individual items listed in that table, we call those the elements. That is essentially the same as the PTS. It looks a little bit different, but the format in itself, areas of operations, task, elements, those are the same. So that's kind of helpful. We do have something new called ACS Codes. I want to explain those just for a moment. Here is an example. Again, this is the same screenshot I showed you a moment ago from pre-flight preparation. You'll see I have a green arrow pointing to PA ID52. That's an ACS code, and those are used quite a bit in this new system, and we'll explain why and how as we keep moving along here. But I did want to spend just a second to kind of help you decode that, and you'll see it's really pretty straightforward. PA represents the certification, so that's private pilot. You know, private pilot airplane in this case, so PA kind of makes sense. And then the 1, the Roman numeral 1, is your area of operation. The D represents your task, in this case cross-country flight planning. And then the last little bit there, the K2 in this example, that represents the element. This particular example is a knowledge element number 2. So you see that I can give you an ACS code, and you can go into the ACS and quickly find the appropriate spot where that code is described. And we use the codes a lot coming up as we get more into the discussion here. So that's just a real brief bit on the ACS codes. I don't think it'll give anybody too much trouble on how that works. So now we're going to talk about the check ride and what has to be included on the examiner's plan of action. I do want to mention before I start, for the flight instructors and for the applicants here, when you're preparing for a check ride, you are responsible for all of the content in the ACS. Just as it was for the PTS, you were responsible for all the content. You may initially be a little set back by that because it's quite a list of content. It really is the same content as the PTS, it's just more defined. We've just outlined things and broken them down to a finer scale. So the content hasn't changed. It's still information from the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. It's just we're more specific about it. So you can take an easy breath and go, okay, so it's really not a ton of new material for me to memorize. It's just laid out a little bit more specifically. But the rest of the discussion we're going to have here is about what has to be on the practical test. But I didn't want to confuse you when you're thinking about the preparation side of it, you have to prepare for all the content because you don't know what you'll get on your practical test. So, what areas of operation are required to be on the practical test? Well, this is a pretty easy one. All areas of operation are required to be tested on the practical test. There is one kind of general exemption, and it'll make sense to you. And that's if the area of operation just does not apply to your category or class. Here's an example. I'm showing you area of operation 10, multi-engine operations. And this has all of the tasks related to multi-engine activities. As you can imagine, if you were given this Checkride, or let's say taking this Checkride in a Skyhawk, well, none of the tasks in area of operation 10 would apply to you. So you wouldn't have to worry about that task. But the rule of thumb is all areas of operation apply. So the second question is, well, what tasks apply? Which task must be included in the plan of action for the practical test? Well, again, this one's pretty straightforward. All tasks must be included in the practical test plan of action, unless it doesn't apply to your category or class. I'll give you an example. This screenshot shows you pre-flight procedures, task D, taxiing, and I've circled it in blue, ASEL, AMEL. So that tells you that this task only applies to airplane single-engine land and airplane multi-engine land applicants. There is another task, task ECHO, I'm showing it on screen there, which is taxiing and sailing, and that applies to airplane single-engine C and airplane multi-engine C. So it's reasonably clear that if you are taking a seaplane Checkride, you would not do task D, but instead do task ECHO, task E. That should be pretty straightforward, and it shouldn't give you too much trouble. So the rule of thumb is all tasks are required unless it doesn't apply to your category or class, you know, as it's marked. Now we're getting down to the best one, my favorite. So I have on screen for you the practical test standard from private pilot airplanes. So this is the PTS, and I'm showing it to you just to kind of help you recognize some of the change and recognize how some of the things are still the same. So in this example, we have a pre-flight inspection task, and it has 3 elements. Element 1 is basically talking about what items you need to inspect during the pre-flight, and it's talking about why you need to inspect those things and how you would detect if there's something wrong with those things. Item 2 is that you use a checklist when you inspect your aircraft, and then item 3 is that you make sure the airplane's in condition for safe flight. So I just kind of wanted to remind you what the PTS looks like with this element, because in a moment I'm going to show you the ACS, and we'll look at how it's a bit different. All of the elements that were in the PTS were incorporated in the ACS. So those 3 items I showed you, the concepts were moved into the ACS. They may not be word for word, they may not be verbatim, they could be moved around a little bit, rearranged, reworded a bit, but the concepts are present. And then we added some additional elements, and those of you that have seen the ACS are shaking your head going, oh boy, did you ever, because we did add some elements. But I want to explain to you why, and it'll make a little more sense why we added these additional elements. Well, the first reason, and in many cases, the PTS concepts were divided into smaller elements. For example, a single element in the PTS may have had 2 or 3 concepts, you know, built into it. And in the PTS, in the ACS, we actually divided those up in some cases into individual elements. So that would account for why we had a growth in element count to some extent. Another big reason we had another big reason that we had an increase in the element count is because we now have to account for knowledge test questions. because every knowledge test question is only included on the knowledge test if it has an appropriate ACS element. If there's not an appropriate matching ACS element, it means really that question shouldn't be asked. That question is not appropriate content. And we did remove a lot of questions from the private knowledge test and instrument knowledge test because they weren't appropriate content. It wasn't appropriate to have. So you'll see a lot of growth in elements because of the knowledge test questions. We also added some elements based on risk management. And then finally, the items that were special emphasis items that used to be in the introduction in the PTS have now been included for every task. They've been built into every task as elements. So you can see for these 4 primary reasons, we had a lot of growth in the element count. But I hope that I sort of explained to you why we have so many more elements. And in a minute, we'll talk about how that's going to impact the Checkride. We did place those elements into 3 groups because there were so many, and really they behave a bit differently. One group is knowledge elements. Those are things that you would need to be able to know, generally speaking. And then we have risk management elements. Those are things that the applicant should consider, risk items during the practical test. And then the third item, or third type of element, is skill elements. Those are things that you would need to perform or do, usually an action on a Checkride. So we have explained why our element count grew, and then we have these 3 new groups. So I'm going to show you how it works when you're dealing with the ACS on your Checkride. So I like to do this just for fun. So this is the PTS, right? This is what we used to have. I hope all of you are sitting down because I'm going to show you the matching task under the ACS. There it is. So don't panic, because rule number 1, there's no panicking on Checkrides, right? So I'm going to explain to you how this works and why you're not going to have a 6-hour Checkride. Even though when you look at this list, you say, oh my gosh, this is going to take forever to get through my Checkride because this is so much information I have to know. By the way, on my 2 green arrows are pointing to the original elements from the PTS. So that's where those concepts were moved into. And you might remember there were actually 3 elements in the PTS, and they actually were reduced to 2 in ACS in this case. Anyway, so I'm going to explain to you in just a moment why we're not going to have a 6-hour Checkride. So required elements to include on the plan of action. Rule number 1, anything that you miss, and I'm speaking from the position of an applicant, anything that the applicant misses on the knowledge test, the related concept has to be included on the plan of action. This isn't a new concept. This has been FAA policy for some time, but it's not been strongly enforced, and the PTS really didn't make it clear. The ACS certainly makes it more clear that any material that was missed on the knowledge test is to be reviewed during the practical test. And that makes sense. You may also remember that your flight instructor has to give you an endorsement that says you review the areas deficient on the knowledge test. So anything that was missed on the knowledge test, your instructor would go over with you, and then you would go to the practical test, and you can certainly expect that similar information to be included during the practical test. I'm going to give you an example of kind of how this might work. You know, knowledge tests today use something called the PLT code to describe what type of information you missed on the knowledge test. For example, it would say PLT 064. That'll be printed on the knowledge test report. And then you go to the learning statement code reference code, and it will tell you that that stands for interpreting information on a sectional chart. And that's what the recommending instructor would review, would be information on a sectional chart. And then the designee, the DPE, whoever's given the Checkride, would make sure to include interpreting information from the sectional chart on the plan of action. So in this case, because there's not a one-to-one match of PLT codes to ACS codes, just like there wasn't a match of PLT codes to PTS element, the designee has to do a bit of review in the ACS to find the appropriate matching concept. For example, PLT 064 was information on a sectional chart. I looked through the pre-flight planning section of the ACS, and I found a code PA1D Kilo 8, so K8, and it says symbology found on VFR charts. That's a really good match, in my opinion. There's not an exact match. There's not an ACS code that says interpret information on a sectional chart. But the concept is the same. So the examiner looks for a reasonable matching concept, and then that information must be included on the practical test. By the way, it could be more than one element. The designee may say that they want to include Kilo 3 and Kilo 4. I don't show those on screen here, but just as an example. So going back to our list of what has to be on the plan of action. So I've already said any subjects missed on a knowledge test must be included in the plan of action. So here's the next rule. At a minimum, the plan of action must include at least one knowledge element. At least one. The designee could select 3, 4, 5, or all elements. So the applicant needs to be prepared to answer any of the elements described in the ACS. But at a minimum, the plan of action must address at least one. It must address at least one risk element. And we're going to look at an example here to make more sense, I think. And then finally, all skill elements must be addressed in the plan of action. I'm going to show you an example. This next little line that talks about elements added, I'm going to try and put that in plain language for you. Basically what that means is that if you added a knowledge element, as an example, if you added a knowledge element because it was missed on the knowledge test, you would not have to add another knowledge element to satisfy the rule of at least one knowledge element. So another way of saying that is anything that's added based on the knowledge test could satisfy these requirements, these minimum requirements. We do have something called sub-elements, and I don't want them to create any headaches for you. It's really very straightforward. You'll notice in this list we have Kilo 4, that's a knowledge element, and then you have Kilo 4A, Kilo 4B, you see the whole list there. Those A, B, C's, all those are called sub-elements. And the only reason it's arranged that way is just because it made sense from an organizational perspective to arrange those things in that manner. You know, it was easier to work with it that way. Sub-elements are treated exactly the same as any other element. So when the designee is constructing their plan of action, they can pick a sub-element just as well as they could pick a regular element. For example, the designee pick 4 hotel, Kilo 4 hotel, which is thunderstorms. That could be their one knowledge element at a minimum if they wanted to include that. So don't let those sub-elements throw you. They're treated just like any other element for the purposes of what must be included on the Checkride. Also, we still allow combining of items. This is just like with the PTS. This hasn't changed. Tasks and elements can be combined, performed concurrently, as long as the evaluator can still, well, evaluate the item sufficiently. We want these tests to be efficient, so it's okay to combine things. So that hasn't changed. So let's look at an example. I think this will really bring it all home for you, and then we'll kind of be on the back end of the presentation. So on the left, I have the rules of thumb, again, of what, at a minimum, must be on the Checkride, what's going to be in the written plan of action. So rule number one, well, and let's do a scenario. We'll kind of work through this. Make believe that you're a designee and you're preparing for a Checkride, which is going to be tomorrow, and you want to make sure that you are covering the appropriate items at a minimum for the Checkride. So the first rule says, number one there, any items from the knowledge test report. We've already discussed this quite a bit. I'm going to give you a sample PLT code. Let's imagine that your PLT code is item 445, as I show there on the screen. And that one stands for recalling regulations about pre-flight. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but you get the idea. So just like we talked about, which is again the same as what we did with the PTS, the examiner should find a reasonable match in the ACS and make sure they include that information in the practical test. So I took a look at this task and I discovered, I'm going to highlight it for you, that item Kilo 3 Delta was a very good match for this particular PLT code. If you look at Kilo 3 Delta, the associated regulations, now that's a sub-element. It'll make more sense if you read the entire group there. So aircraft pre-flight inspection, including associated regulations. So it kind of makes more sense when you read it that way. So that's a pretty good match with our PLT code. So I, as the designee, am going to include Kilo 3 Delta in my plan of action. So we have satisfied the first rule of what must be on the Checkride. The second rule is you have to have at least one knowledge element, at least one K element. Well, honestly, I already have a K element, don't I? I picked it up based on the knowledge test report. I could, as the examiner, select another one or several more. It's up to me. But in this case, I could also call that rule satisfied. I don't have to add another one if I don't want to. So I've got my one knowledge element minimum satisfied. The next rule says I have to have at least one risk element. So you see that there are risk management elements. There's 6 of them, about middle of the page. I didn't have anything related to that on the knowledge test, so honestly, it's going to be designee's pick. Designee can look at those and pick one that works well for their plan of action, for their scenario. I'm going to choose external pressures for my plan of action. That's Romeo 2, risk 2. I could pick more of them if I wanted to. And on the next Checkride I perform, I'm going to pick a different one so that folks don't get too used to me always picking Romeo 2. I don't want the Checkride to be too predictable. So that satisfies the rule of at least one R element. The last rule is I have to include all skill elements. So this makes it pretty straightforward. My plan of action has to test, has to evaluate all of the skill elements listed 1 through 6. I can't pick and choose. All of those will be tested. So as you can see from this particular task, I'm only going to include those 6 skill elements and then 1 risk and 1 knowledge. So that's how we're not going to have a 6-hour Checkride. Once again, from the training side of it, from the preparation side, as an applicant, you still have to be prepared to answer any of those topics because you don't necessarily know what will be on your practical. With one exception, right? You know you're going to have questions related to anything missed on your knowledge test. You know that you'll have that one, so you're going to make sure you study up on those. So that's kind of helpful, I suppose. So I hope that scenario kind of walks you through a bit and helps you understand kind of how it works. We've had a lot of questions about the timing of knowledge elements and risk elements, and I want to kind of explain what that means. Every task now has knowledge elements and risk elements, and of course they all have skill elements. But what is confusing some people, and we understand why, is you may have a flight task, something that is clearly a flight maneuver, such as steep turns. Let's use steep turns as an example. Well, steep turns, all of those skills related, you'll perform in the airplane, you know, because you're going to go perform steep turns. There's no big surprise there. But the question has been from the designees, when can they ask the knowledge and risk related elements? They have to select at least one knowledge and one risk. And the question is, well, do they have to ask that in the airplane during the maneuver? Or can they ask that during the oral? We would certainly encourage you to address those things as much as practical in the oral. That is a much more appropriate time to have a discussion about the risks involved in steep turns and load factor, distractions, all those sorts of things. It makes much more sense to discuss them in the oral when you're sitting at a table and you can, you know, discuss these things. However, the examiner can also evaluate those items in the airplane. So there's no prohibition from asking questions in the flight. You remember that even though there is a distinct oral phase and then a flight phase, oral questions are certainly expected and allowed to continue into the flight. And that's been the same with the PTS, and it remains the same with the ACS. But we do encourage examiners to move these K and R elements into the oral where practical. It just makes more sense to do that. So I hope that that kind of sorts that one out. Here's an example, slow flight and stalls. So you see that there are K elements and there are R elements. So those could be evaluated during the oral portion of the Checkride, which would just make more sense. But it is fair game to be evaluated in the flight portion if that's appropriate. So hope that that kind of sorts out that frequent question. So we're really coming towards the end of the presentation. Just a few things I want to wrap up with you. What else is being impacted? Well, we did have to make some changes to IACRA. Nothing too significant. The IACRA system, as you may be aware, whenever you issue a notice of disapproval or a letter of discontinuance, I'm really speaking to the designees in this case because they're the folks that are going to see this, but you are presented with a table, and the table lists the areas of operations. Well, the areas of operations for the private pilot did change a little bit, so we had to update those tables in IACRA. The tables in the instrument ACS did not change from the PTS, so that wasn't impacted. We also did make some significant changes to our knowledge test questions. I didn't really go into detail. I can mention it now for you. I did describe the old process of how we used to make knowledge test questions, but I want to tell you briefly how we make knowledge test questions today. So when one of those safety inspectors creates a knowledge test question today, it goes before what we call a board. And the first thing the board looks at is there an appropriate ACS code? In other words, is this a valid question to ask? Is the content appropriate? Additionally, this board has usually anywhere from, let's say, 6 to 8 subject matter experts. One of those individuals is an industry participant. It's not an FAA employee. It's one of those folks that is involved in our, that we're involved in the ACS development. Now, our questions, contrary to popular belief, are not released to the public. So the agency creates questions, they get boarded by this boarding group to determine that it's a valid question and it's appropriate, which it does include one industry member, but then the questions are not released to the public. They would then go to a, to the knowledge testing system and eventually show up on a test. So that's been a big change. Any of you that have taken a private airplane or instrument airplane knowledge test in the last 6 or 8 months or so, you have actually been taking an ACS test. We hope that you've seen an improvement in the quality of the questions, and that you see that it's not about memorization, it's about understanding the material. So that's been a pretty big change. Knowledge test reports are going to change in the future. I'm going to give you an example, and I think you'll be really excited about the change, especially the designees and flight instructors. This is what the current knowledge test report looks like. Has a PLT code. I've highlighted one of the PLT codes at the bottom, just like what we discussed. And then you have to go look at the learning statement guide and determine what does that content actually mean. And then you have to find a reasonable match in the ACS, and that's what gets included in the plan of action. In the future, we are going to print the ACS codes directly on the knowledge test report. We're really excited about this future update. You can imagine how easy that would be. For example, those are the rules, right? This should look familiar to you because this is what we already looked at. But for example, now you would have an ACS code directly on the knowledge test report, and you can go straight to it when preparing for the plan of action. And that would really make things much simpler. You wouldn't have to search for an appropriate match. So when's it going into effect? This is kind of a trick question, because the private pilot airplane and instrument airplane, they went into effect on June 15th, 2016. Now that was only for private airplane and instrument airplane. The private airplane PTS was removed. I do want to point out that the instrument PTS is still available on our website, because that particular PTS, as you may remember, also includes content for rotorcraft and power lift. So that one has to stay available for use. But anyone applying for private airplane, private pilot airplane, or instrument airplane will be using the new ACS as of June 15th. We have also published the Unmanned Aircraft Systems ACS. It's also available. Commercial ATP flight instructor are in development. We have ACS documents in various stages of design for all of these, and we hope to roll them out over the next months as we go. It will take some time to transition. Some suggestions that we have for you: well, take some time to get familiar with the ACS. Sit down, go over the document. You will likely have questions after you have reviewed the document. We have a very substantial frequently asked questions document at the AFS 630 website. I bet your question has probably already been asked. So we encourage you to look at the FAQs and see if you can find something there that may help answer your question. We do also have an email address I'll give you in just a moment, where you can submit questions to our ACS focus team, and they are very responsive. They will reply to you with an answer. Okay, so where can you get additional information? Again, you don't need to write these down. I'm going to give you this presentation so you'll have it. The first link is our AFS 630 website. and that's where we include all of our frequently asked questions, as well as the ACS document and some other informational materials there as well about the ACS. I would suggest that you subscribe to updates. There's a button there that says subscribe, and that means whenever there's a change with AFS 630's website, you'll get an email, and then you'll know to go back and check up on the changes. We do have an ACS focus team, and these folks are able to answer your questions. There's the email address. We do take questions from the public as well as internal. This is kind of a new process. Historically, the agency has used focus teams for employees only, but we recognize how important and how big of a change this is, and so we encourage not only FA employees but also the public to use this to ask questions. And don't forget, we do offer an additional online training course at fasafety.gov, ALC 449. And as I mentioned at the beginning, any questions that you have submitted during the presentation or that you choose to submit right now will be answered in a few days by email. You'll get to see everyone's questions as well as the answers. We find that's the best way to give everyone an appropriate answer in a timely fashion. This essentially concludes our website.